The gavel slammed down with the force of thunder, its echo reverberating through the packed federal courthouse in downtown Phoenix. Judge Edward Chen's black robes billowed as he leaned forward, his weathered face twisted into a sneer that had become his signature expression over 23 years on the bench. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting harsh shadows across the mahogany-paneled courtroom, where careers were made and destroyed with the swing of his gavel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Pam Bondi stood at the plaintiff's table, her navy blue suit immaculate despite the grueling 3-day trial. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a professional chignon, not a strand out of place, but her blue eyes blazed with barely contained fury. She had been practicing law for over 2 decades, had faced down drug cartels and corrupt politicians, but she had never encountered such blatant judicial misconduct in her entire career. Chen's voice cut through the tension like a rusty blade. Ms. Bondi, if you think your little theatrical performance is going to sway this court, you are sorely mistaken. I've seen more convincing arguments from first-year law students. His lips curled into a cruel smile as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. Perhaps you should consider a career change more suited to your dramatic talents. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Journalists in the gallery exchanged shocked glances, their pens frozen over their notepads. Even the court stenographer's fingers hesitated over her machine. In the 23 years Judge Chen had presided over Federal District Court of Arizona, he had gained a reputation for being difficult, temperamental, and occasionally harsh. But this level of personal attack against an attorney was unprecedented, even for him. Bondi's co-counsel, Marcus Rivera, a seasoned litigator with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, placed a steadying hand on her arm. He had warned her about Chen's reputation, had suggested they request a different judge, but the case assignment had been random and final. Now he watched helplessly as the judge's animosity toward Bondi became increasingly personal and unprofessional. What the packed courtroom didn't know was that Chen's hostility wasn't random. 3 months earlier, Bondi had filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission regarding Chen's handling of immigration cases. She had documented pattern after pattern of bias, procedural violations, and what she believed to be clear evidence of judicial corruption. The complaint was still under investigation, sealed from public view, but Chen knew exactly who had filed it. In the gallery, Detective Sarah Mitchell of the Phoenix Police Department's white-collar crime unit sat in the back row, her trained eyes taking in every detail. She wore a simple gray blazer and black slacks, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. To anyone observing, she appeared to be just another interested observer of the high-profile case. In reality, she was gathering evidence for an investigation that had been months in the making. Mitchell's partner detective, James Rodriguez, sat 3 rows ahead, posing as a freelance journalist. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and he wore a rumpled brown jacket that made him blend in perfectly with the actual reporters present. Both detectives had their phones set to record, though the devices were carefully concealed. They had been tracking Chen's activities for 6 months, following a money trail that led from offshore accounts to real estate investments, to a pattern of favorable rulings that defied legal precedent. The case before the court involved Meridian Industries, a multinational corporation accused of environmental violations that had poisoned groundwater in 3 Arizona counties. Bondi represented the affected communities, seeking damages that could reach into the hundreds of millions. The evidence was overwhelming. Internal company memos acknowledging the contamination, scientific studies proving the link to increased cancer rates, and testimony from whistleblowers who had risked their careers to expose the truth. Yet Chen had spent 3 days systematically dismantling Bondi's case, overruling legitimate objections, allowing inadmissible evidence from the defense, and now launching personal attacks that crossed every line of judicial ethics. What he didn't realize was that his behavior was being recorded, not just by the court reporter, but by federal investigators who had been building a case against him for months. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the lead environmental scientist whose research had exposed Meridian's contamination, sat in the witness section with her hands clenched in her lap. She had spent 15 years studying the effects of industrial pollution on rural communities, and her findings in this case were irrefutable. Yet Chen had spent an hour that morning attacking her credentials, questioning her methodology, and implying that her research was biased because she had received grant funding from environmental groups. Vasquez caught Bondi's eye and gave her a subtle nod of encouragement. She had worked with the attorney for 2 years preparing this case, had seen Bondi's unwavering commitment to seeking justice for the affected families. The communities they represented weren't wealthy or politically connected. They were farmers, small business owners, and working families who had watched their children develop rare cancers and their livestock die from contaminated water. In the front row of the gallery sat Maria Santos, a mother of 3 whose youngest daughter had been diagnosed with leukemia at age 7. The medical bills had bankrupted the family, forcing them to sell their farm that had been in Maria's family for 4 generations. Her weathered hands gripped a photo of her daughter, Isabella, who was now in remission but would need ongoing medical care for the rest of her life. Beside Maria sat Robert Chen, no relation to the judge despite sharing a surname. Robert had lost his cattle ranch when his entire herd died from drinking contaminated water. The 62-year-old rancher had tried to rebuild, but the legal costs of fighting Meridian had consumed his life savings. His presence in the courtroom represented not just his own losses, but those of dozens of other families who couldn't afford to take time off work to attend the trial. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Judge Chen seemed oblivious to the human cost of his judicial misconduct. He continued his attack on Bondi with increasing venom. Your entire argument, counselor, is built on emotional manipulation rather than legal precedent. This court will not be swayed by your attempts to turn these proceedings into a circus. Bondi took a deep breath, centering herself. She had faced down corrupt officials before, had prosecuted cases where justice seemed impossible. She would not be intimidated by a bully in robes, regardless of his position. Your Honor, with respect, I am simply presenting the evidence as required by law. The facts in this case are clear and overwhelming. Chen's face reddened. Don't lecture me about the law, Ms. Bondi. I was presiding over cases when you were still in law school. Your reputation for grandstanding may impress the media, but it holds no weight in my courtroom. What Chen didn't see was the slight movement in the gallery as Detective Mitchell adjusted her position to get a better angle with her concealed recording device. Every word of his unprofessional tirade was being captured, adding to the mountain of evidence that federal investigators had been accumulating. The defense attorney, Harold Westbrook, a silver-haired corporate lawyer from a prestigious Denver firm, shifted uncomfortably at his table. Even he seemed taken aback by the judge's blatant hostility toward opposing counsel. Westbrook had been practicing environmental defense law for 30 years and had never witnessed such obvious bias from the bench. While Chen's favoritism toward the defense was helpful for his client, Westbrook was experienced enough to recognize that such conduct could result in an automatic reversal on appeal. Westbrook's assistant, Jennifer Kane, a sharp young associate fresh from Harvard Law, frantically scribbled notes on her legal pad. She had researched Chen's record before the trial and found his reversal rate to be suspiciously low, especially in cases involving large corporate defendants. The pattern suggested either remarkable legal acumen or something far more troubling. In the courtroom's technology booth, Audiovisual technician David Park monitored the recording equipment that captured every moment of the proceedings. Park had worked in federal courts for 12 years and had never seen a judge behave so unprofessionally. He made careful notes of the timestamps for each of Chen's outbursts, knowing that this footage would likely be scrutinized by appellate courts and possibly federal investigators. Behind the scenes, forces were already in motion that would forever change the trajectory of this trial. FBI Special Agent Lisa Chun, ironically sharing the judge's surname, sat in a van parked outside the courthouse, monitoring radio communications. From the detectives inside, she commanded a task force that had been investigating judicial corruption in the federal court system for 2 years. Judge Edward Chen had been on their radar for 18 months, ever since a whistleblower had come forward with evidence of suspicious financial transactions. The investigation had revealed a complex web of corruption involving offshore accounts, real estate investments, and a pattern of favorable rulings in cases involving specific corporate defendants. Chun had received over $2 million in concealed payments over the past 5 years, money that had been carefully laundered through shell companies and cryptocurrency transactions. Agent Chun's team had spent months gathering evidence, tracking financial records, and documenting the judge's pattern of biased rulings. They had wiretaps on his personal phone, surveillance footage of secret meetings, and testimony from multiple witnesses. The investigation was codenamed Operation Scales of Justice, and today was the day they would finally act. Back in the courtroom, Judge Chen continued his assault on Bondi's character and competence. Ms. Bondi, your melodramatic presentation style may work well for television cameras, but this is a court of law. We deal in facts here, not fiction. The irony of his words was not lost on Detective Mitchell, who knew that Chun's own conduct represented a complete fiction of judicial impartiality. She glanced at her watch, noting that it was now 3:47 p.m. According to the operation timeline, federal agents would move to arrest Chen at exactly 4 p.m., timing the action to occur during a brief recess that had been carefully orchestrated. Bondi maintained her professional composure despite the judge's increasingly personal attacks. She had dealt with bullies before and knew that showing weakness would only encourage more aggressive behavior. Your Honor, I respectfully request that we focus on the legal merits of this case rather than personal characterizations. Chun's eyes flashed with anger. You will speak when spoken to, counselor. Your constant interruptions and objections are testing this court's patience. Perhaps a few days in jail for contempt would teach you some respect for judicial authority. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Several attorneys in the gallery shifted nervously, recognizing that Chun was threatening to abuse his contempt powers for purely personal reasons. Such behavior was not only unethical, but potentially criminal. Dr. Vasquez felt her stomach clench as she watched the proceedings devolve into judicial bullying. She had testified in dozens of court cases over her career, but had never witnessed such blatant misconduct from a sitting judge. The families affected by Meridian's contamination deserved better than this mockery of justice. Marcus Rivera finally stood, his voice calm but firm. Your Honor, I must object to the court's characterization of opposing counsel. Ms. Bondi has conducted herself professionally throughout these proceedings. Chun turned his venom toward Rivera. Mr. Rivera, you would be wise to control your co-counsel before I hold you both in contempt. This court will not tolerate disrespect from attorneys who think they can grandstand their way to victory. What Chun didn't realize was that his own words were being transmitted in real time to federal agents positioned throughout the courthouse. Agent Chun monitored the audio feed from her command post, coordinating with her team as they prepared to execute the arrest warrant that had been sealed until this moment. The investigation into Judge Chen had begun 18 months earlier when former court clerk Thomas Wright had contacted the FBI with evidence of financial irregularities. Wright had worked in Chun's chambers for 3 years before his conscience finally compelled him to report what he had witnessed. He had documented meetings between the judge and corporate representatives, recorded conversations about case outcomes, and provided financial records that showed unexplained deposits into Chun's personal accounts. Wright's evidence had led to a comprehensive investigation involving the FBI, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Department of Justice's Public Integrity Section. Agents had traced money flows from Meridian Industries and other corporations through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts before it reached Chun's personal investments. The timing of the arrest had been carefully planned to coincide with Chun's most egregious display of bias. Federal prosecutors wanted to demonstrate the connection between his financial corruption and his judicial misconduct. By allowing his behavior to escalate during this high-profile trial, they were building an unshakable case for both corruption and obstruction of justice. Detective Rodriguez adjusted his position in the gallery, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of unusual activity. He had been working white-collar crime cases for 15 years and had learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a target was about to be arrested. The careful positioning of federal agents, the timing of the proceedings, and the judge's increasingly erratic behavior all pointed to an imminent conclusion to months of investigation. In the witness section, Maria Santos continued to clutch her daughter's photograph, unaware that justice was finally approaching for the man who had been paid to deny her family compensation for their suffering. Isabella's medical treatments had cost over $400,000, money the family didn't have. Medicaid covered some expenses, but experimental treatments and specialized care had forced the family into crushing debt. Robert Chun, the rancher, watched the proceedings with growing anger as Judge Chen continued his unprofessional attacks on the attorney representing their interests. Robert had lost everything to Meridian's contamination, and now the judge seemed determined to ensure that the company would face no consequences for their environmental crimes. Judge Chen, oblivious to the forces closing in around him, continued his tirade. "Ms. Bondi, your reputation for seeking publicity through sensationalized cases is well known in legal circles. This court deals in law, not public relations campaigns." The personal nature of his attacks was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone in the courtroom. Even Harold Westbrook, the defense attorney, began to look uncomfortable with the judge's behavior. Westbrook recognized that such obvious bias could result in an automatic reversal of any favorable ruling, potentially forcing his client to face a new trial with a different judge. Jennifer Kane, Westbrook's associate, made detailed notes of each inappropriate comment from the bench. Her Harvard law training had taught her to recognize judicial misconduct, and Chun's behavior was so egregious that it would likely result in appellate review regardless of the trial's outcome. At 3:55 p.m., Detective Mitchell received a subtle hand signal from her partner Rodriguez. Federal agents were now in position throughout the courthouse, ready to execute the arrest warrant that would end Judge Chun's career and expose the corruption that had infected his courtroom for years. Agent Chun's voice crackled through the radio communications. "All units, prepare for execution. Target is in position. Move on my signal." The courtroom continued its proceedings, unaware that history was about to be made. Judge Chen had just finished another diatribe against Bondi when he announced, "This court will take a 15-minute recess. We will reconvene at 4:15 p.m. As he began to rise from the bench, the courtroom doors burst open simultaneously. Federal agents in dark suits flooded into the room, their badges prominently displayed, their voices clear and authoritative. "Judge Edward Chen, you are under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, money laundering, and obstruction of justice." The federal agents moved with practiced precision, their coordinated entry transforming the dignified courtroom into a crime scene in mere seconds. Judge Edward Chen stood frozen behind the bench, his gavel still clutched in his right hand, as if it could somehow protect him from the inevitable reckoning that had finally arrived. Special Agent Lisa Chen, no relation to the judge despite their shared surname, stepped forward with the arrest warrant in her hand. Her voice cut through the stunned silence with crystal clarity. "Your Honor, you need to step down from the bench and place your hands behind your back." The irony was not lost on anyone present that an Agent Chen was arresting Judge Chen. Lisa Chen had spent 2 years of her life tracking the judge's corruption, following money trails that led from corporate boardrooms to offshore accounts to the very bench where he now stood trembling. Judge Chen's face had turned ashen, the arrogant sneer that had defined his demeanor just moments earlier replaced by genuine terror. His wire-rimmed glasses slipped down his nose as his hands began to shake uncontrollably. "This is outrageous," he stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I am a federal judge. You cannot just burst into my courtroom," and Agent Chen interrupted him with professional calm. "Sir, we have a valid arrest warrant signed by Chief Judge Patricia Morrison of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. You need to comply with our instructions immediately." The gallery erupted into chaos as journalists scrambled for their phones and cameras, recognizing that they were witnessing one of the most dramatic moments in federal court history. The arrest of a sitting federal judge was unprecedented in Arizona's legal community, and the reporters present knew they were documenting a story that would dominate headlines for months. Detective Sarah Mitchell finally revealed her true identity. Standing from her position in the back row and displaying her Phoenix Police Department badge. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm and stay in your seats. This is a lawful arrest being conducted by federal authorities." Pam Bondi stood motionless at the plaintiff's table, watching as months of investigation culminated in this moment of justice. The same judge who had spent the afternoon insulting her competence and character was now being read his Miranda rights by federal agents. The vindication felt surreal, almost dreamlike in its sudden arrival. Marcus Rivera placed a steadying hand on Bondi's shoulder, his expression mixing relief with amazement. In 30 years of practicing law, he had never witnessed anything approaching this level of courtroom drama. "Did you know this was coming?" he whispered. Bondi shook her head slowly. "I filed a complaint about his conduct months ago, but I had no idea it would lead to this." Dr. Alina Vasquez watched from the witness section as federal agents approached the bench, her scientific mind struggling to process the sudden shift from judicial proceedings to criminal arrest. The environmental scientist had testified in hundreds of cases, but had never seen a judge taken into custody during active litigation. Judge Chen made one final attempt to assert his authority. "I demand to speak with my attorney. This is a violation of judicial immunity, and I will ensure that everyone involved in this travesty faces consequences." Agent Chen's response was measured and professional. "Sir, judicial immunity does not extend to criminal conduct. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly advise you to exercise that right. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The handcuffs clicked into place with a metallic finality that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Edward Chen, who had wielded absolute power over legal proceedings for 23 years, was now just another criminal defendant being processed by the justice system he had corrupted. Harold Westbrook, the defense attorney representing Meridian Industries, sat in stunned silence as he realized the implications of the arrest. Any favorable rulings from Judge Chen would now be scrutinized for evidence of corruption, potentially invalidating months of legal strategy. His client's case had just become exponentially more complicated. Jennifer Kane, Westbrook's Harvard-educated associate, frantically typed notes on her laptop as she witnessed legal history in the making. Her constitutional law professors had discussed theoretical scenarios involving judicial corruption, but she had never imagined witnessing such events firsthand. As the agents escorted Judge Chen toward the courtroom exit, he made one final desperate plea. "You're making a mistake. I have served this court with distinction for over 2 decades. My record speaks for itself." Detective James Rodriguez, who had spent months gathering evidence of Chen's corruption, couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. "Your record is exactly why you're being arrested, Your Honor. We've documented every suspicious ruling, every unexplained financial transaction, every meeting with corporate representatives that you failed to disclose." The courtroom doors closed behind the arrested judge, leaving a stunned silence in their wake. Bailiff Margaret Thompson, who had worked with Chen for 15 years, stood motionless behind the bench, unsure of how to proceed. In all her years of court service, she had never faced a situation where the presiding judge was arrested during active proceedings. Agent Chen addressed the remaining courtroom occupants with professional authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, these proceedings are now suspended pending judicial reassignment. You will be contacted by the Court Administration Office regarding rescheduling. Please exit the courtroom in an orderly fashion." Maria Santos, the mother whose daughter had suffered from leukemia caused by meridian's contamination, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. For months, she had watched Judge Chen systematically dismantle their case, ruling against every piece of evidence that demonstrated her daughter's suffering. The arrest felt like divine intervention, a sudden shift in the cosmic balance toward justice. Robert Chen, the rancher who had lost everything to contaminated groundwater, stood slowly from his seat in the gallery. The irony of sharing a surname with the corrupt judge was not lost on him. "Does this mean we might actually get a fair trial?" he asked quietly. Bondi turned toward the affected families in the gallery, her voice filled with renewed hope. "This means that justice has a real chance now. We'll start fresh with a new judge, one who hasn't been compromised by corporate influence." Dr. Vasquez gathered her research materials, her mind already racing toward the implications of a new trial. With an impartial judge, her environmental studies would finally receive the fair hearing they deserved, without a biased jurist attacking her methodology and credentials for personal gain. Detective Mitchell coordinated with federal agents to secure the crime scene, ensuring that all court records and electronic devices in Chen's chambers would be preserved as evidence. The investigation into his corruption was far from over. Today's arrest was just the beginning of a complex prosecution that would expose the full extent of his criminal enterprise. Outside the courthouse, news vans were already arriving as word of the arrest spread through legal and media circles. The story of a federal judge being arrested during active proceedings would dominate news cycles across the country, raising questions about judicial integrity and the effectiveness of oversight mechanisms. Audiovisual technician David Park carefully preserved all recordings from the day's proceedings, knowing that Chen's final moments on the bench would be analyzed by legal scholars and federal prosecutors for years to come. The judge's arrogant insults toward Pam Bondi, delivered just minutes before his arrest, would become evidence of his consciousness of guilt and his contempt for the judicial system he had sworn to uphold. FBI Special Agent Lisa Chen coordinated the evidence collection from her command post, ensuring that every aspect of the arrest was properly documented. The operation had taken 18 months to plan and execute, involving dozens of agents and prosecutors working across multiple jurisdictions. The investigation had revealed that Judge Chen's corruption extended far beyond the Meridian Industries case. Federal agents had documented suspicious rulings in dozens of cases involving environmental law, corporate liability, and immigration matters. The pattern suggested a systematic scheme to sell judicial decisions to the highest bidder. Thomas Wright, the former court clerk whose whistleblowing had initiated the investigation, watched the arrest coverage from his home in Tucson. He had risked his career and personal safety to expose Chen's corruption, and today's events validated his decision to come forward despite the personal costs. Wright's evidence had included recordings of phone conversations between Chen and co-state corporate representatives, photographs of secret meetings at expensive restaurants, and financial records showing unexplained deposits into the judge's personal accounts. His testimony would be crucial in the upcoming prosecution. The money trail that federal investigators had followed led through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts designed to conceal the source of Chen's bribes. Meridian Industries had paid over $800,000 to influence rulings in environmental cases, while other corporations had contributed additional funds for favorable decisions in their litigation. Chen's lifestyle had reflected his hidden income through expensive real estate purchases, luxury vacations, and high-end vehicles that were inconsistent with a federal judge's salary. Investigators had documented properties in Scottsdale, Aspen, and the Cayman Islands that Chen had acquired through his corruption proceeds. The arrest warrant had been sealed until the moment of execution to prevent Chen from destroying evidence or fleeing the jurisdiction. Federal prosecutors had learned that corrupt public officials often had sophisticated escape plans that could be activated if they received advance warning of impending charges. As Bondi and Rivera gathered their materials to leave the courtroom, they reflected on the dramatic turn of events that had transformed their environmental litigation into a federal corruption case. The families they represented would finally have an opportunity for justice in a courtroom free from corporate influence. The legal implications of Chen's arrest extended far beyond the Meridian Industries case. Defense attorneys across Arizona were already filing motions requesting review of cases where Chen had issued questionable rulings. The appellate courts would be flooded with petitions claiming that their clients had been denied fair trials due to judicial corruption. Judge Chen's arrest sent shockwaves through the federal judiciary, prompting calls for enhanced oversight and transparency in judicial conduct. Legal scholars and reform advocates would use this case as an example of why stronger safeguards were needed to prevent future corruption. The timing of the arrest, occurring just minutes after Chen's insulting tirade against Bondi, created a powerful narrative about karma and justice that would resonate far beyond legal circles. The image of an arrogant judge being dragged away in handcuffs became an instant symbol of accountability, finally reaching those who considered themselves above the law. As the courtroom emptied, the weight of history settled over the mahogany-paneled chamber, where justice had been both corrupted and ultimately restored. The scales of justice, blindfolded and impartial, had finally tipped toward truth after months of being manipulated by greed and corruption. Federal prosecutors would spend months preparing for Chen's trial, gathering evidence from the thousands of cases he had handled during his tenure on the bench. The investigation would reveal the full scope of his criminal enterprise and ensure that justice would finally be served for all those who had been denied fair treatment in his courtroom. The arrest of Judge Edward Chen marked a turning point, not just for the Meridian Industries case, but for the entire concept of judicial accountability in America. No judge, regardless of their position or tenure, was above the law when they chose to corrupt the sacred trust placed in them by the Constitution and the American people. The Phoenix Metropolitan Detention Center buzzed with unusual activity. As news of Judge Edward Chen's arrest spread through the facility like wildfire, correctional officers who had processed thousands of inmates over their careers had never seen a federal judge brought through their doors in handcuffs, and the gravity of the situation was not lost on anyone present. Chen sat in a stark holding cell, his black judicial robes replaced by an orange jumpsuit that stripped away any remaining vestiges of his former authority. The man who had commanded absolute respect in his courtroom just hours earlier now found himself subjected to the same dehumanizing process that he had sentenced countless defendants to endure. Detective Sarah Mitchell stood outside the holding area, coordinating with federal prosecutors as they prepared for Chen's initial arraignment. The evidence she had gathered during months of undercover surveillance would form the backbone of the government's case, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her careful work had contributed to bringing down one of Arizona's most corrupt officials. Special Agent Lisa Chen reviewed the comprehensive case file that her team had assembled over 18 months of investigation. The financial evidence alone filled 14 bankers' boxes, documenting a complex web of bribes, kickbacks, and money laundering that stretched from Phoenix to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. The Swiss banking records had been particularly difficult to obtain, requiring diplomatic negotiations and international legal assistance treaties. Agent Chen had spent weeks in Geneva working with financial investigators to trace the flow of corporate money through shell companies designed to conceal the true recipients of the funds. At his law firm's downtown Phoenix offices, defense attorney Marcus Rivera worked late into the evening, preparing for the next phase of the Meridian Industries litigation. The arrest of Judge Chen had created unprecedented legal territory, and Rivera knew that the case would now receive scrutiny from appellate courts and legal scholars across the country. Rivera's paralegal Sandra Martinez compiled research on judicial recusal procedures and corruption precedents, searching for cases that might provide guidance on how to proceed when a presiding judge was arrested for taking bribes related to the pending litigation. The legal databases yielded few relevant precedents, highlighting just how extraordinary the situation had become. Pam Bondi sat in her hotel room overlooking downtown Phoenix, processing the dramatic events that had transformed her environmental case into a federal corruption scandal. She had dedicated 2 years of her life to seeking justice for the families affected by Meridian's contamination, never imagining that the greatest obstacle would be a criminal judge rather than corporate lawyers. The phone calls had started. Within an hour of Chen's arrest, reporters from major networks wanted exclusive interviews, legal analysts sought expert commentary, and law schools requested her presence at symposiums about judicial corruption. Bondi declined most requests, focusing instead on the families whose lives had been devastated by both environmental poisoning and judicial misconduct. Dr. Elena Vasquez returned to her laboratory at Arizona State University, where graduate students and colleagues peppered her with questions about the dramatic courtroom arrest. As one of the nation's leading experts on environmental contamination, Vasquez had testified in hundreds of cases, but none had garnered the attention that Chen's arrest had brought to the Meridian litigation. Her research on groundwater contamination had taken 5 years to complete, involving soil samples from 3 counties and water testing that revealed contamination levels far exceeding federal safety standards. The scientific evidence was irrefutable, but Chen's bias had prevented it from receiving fair consideration. The graduate students in Vasquez's environmental science program saw her testimony in the Meridian case as a real-world application of their academic studies. The arrest had transformed their professor into a minor celebrity within scientific circles, and several students had already expressed interest in studying judicial bias in environmental litigation for their dissertation. Research. At Meridian Industries' corporate headquarters in Denver, emergency board meetings convened as executives struggled to contain the fallout from Chen's arrest. The company's stock price had plummeted 15% in after-hours trading as investors realized that their legal strategy had been based on bribing a federal judge. Corporate General Counsel Patricia Wells faced the unenviable task of explaining to the board of directors how their legal department had become entangled in a federal corruption investigation. Internal emails and financial records were being subpoenaed by federal prosecutors, and Wells knew that several executives could face criminal charges if evidence of their knowledge about the bribes emerged. The company's environmental compliance records were also under fresh scrutiny as federal investigators examined whether Meridian had engaged in similar corruption schemes in other jurisdictions. Internal audits revealed patterns of legal victories that seemed statistically improbable unless external factors had influenced judicial decision-making. Harold Westbrook, Meridian's lead defense attorney, found himself in an ethical minefield as he contemplated how to represent a client whose previous legal victories might have been obtained through criminal means. The prestigious Denver law firm that employed him was conducting its own internal investigation to determine whether any partners had knowledge of Chen's corruption. Westbrook's assistant, Jennifer Kane, worked through the night researching legal precedents for cases where judicial corruption had been discovered during active litigation. Her Harvard law training had covered theoretical scenarios involving corrupt judges, but the practical implications were proving far more complex than academic discussions had suggested. The young associate discovered that federal courts had little experience handling cases where sitting judges were arrested for corruption related to pending litigation. Most judicial corruption cases involved conduct that was discovered years after the affected trials had concluded, allowing appellate courts to address the misconduct through post-conviction relief procedures. Thomas Wright, the former court clerk whose whistleblowing had initiated the federal investigation, sat in his Tucson home watching news coverage of Chen's arrest with a mixture of vindication and anxiety. He had risked his career and personal safety to expose the corruption, and the validation felt both satisfying and terrifying. Wright's evidence had included audio recordings of phone conversations between Chen and corporate representatives, secretly photographed documents showing financial transactions, and detailed logs of the judge's meetings with attorneys whose cases were pending before his court. The former clerk had worn recording devices and hidden cameras for months, gathering evidence while maintaining his normal duties. The personal cost of Wright's whistleblowing had been substantial. He had been forced to leave his position, faced financial hardship while the investigation remained secret, and endured months of anxiety about potential retaliation if his role as an informant was discovered before Chen's arrest. Federal prosecutors had kept Wright's identity secret throughout the investigation, using his evidence to corroborate other sources and build independent verification of Chen's criminal conduct. The former clerk would be a key witness in the May upcoming trial, his insider knowledge providing crucial context for the financial evidence. Agent Lisa Chen coordinated with federal prosecutors as they prepared for Chen's arraignment, scheduled for the following morning. The complexity of the charges required careful presentation to ensure that all aspects of the corruption scheme were properly documented and explained to the court. The money laundering charges alone involved dozens of transactions spanning multiple countries and financial institutions. Federal prosecutors had worked with international partners to trace funds from corporate accounts through shell companies to Chen's personal investments, creating a paper trail that would be nearly impossible for defense attorneys to challenge. The bribery charges were supported by recorded conversations, financial records, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed Chen's suspicious conduct. Federal investigators had documented a clear pattern of favorable rulings that corresponded directly with payments received through his money laundering network. Obstruction of justice charges stemmed from Chen's attempts to influence the federal investigation once he became aware that his conduct was under scrutiny. Wiretapped phone calls revealed his efforts to contact potential witnesses and coordinate false testimony to conceal his criminal activities. Inside the federal courthouse where Chen had presided for over 2 decades, court administrators worked frantically to reassign his pending cases to other judges. The administrative burden was enormous, involving hundreds of active cases that would need to be reviewed for potential corruption issues. Chief Judge Patricia Morrison of the District of Arizona faced unprecedented challenges in maintaining judicial operations while ensuring that Chen's corruption had not compromised other cases. Morrison ordered comprehensive reviews of all rulings issued by Chen over the previous 5 years, focusing particularly on cases involving corporate defendants. The judicial review process revealed troubling patterns in Chen's decision-making that extended far beyond the Meridian Industries case. Statistical analysis showed that Chen ruled in favor of corporate defendants at rates significantly higher than other federal judges, suggesting that his corruption might have affected dozens of additional cases. Court clerks and administrative staff who had worked with Chen for years struggled to reconcile their professional relationships with the reality of his criminal conduct. Many had considered him a demanding but fair judge, unaware of the corruption that had influenced his decision-making behind the scenes. Maria Santos returned to her modest home in rural Maricopa County, where her daughter Isabella was recovering from her latest round of chemotherapy treatments. The 9-year-old had been fighting leukemia for 2 years, her illness directly linked to drinking water contaminated by Meridian's industrial discharge. The family's medical bills had exceeded $600,000, forcing them to declare bankruptcy and lose the farm that had been in Maria's family for 4 generations. Medicaid covered basic treatment costs, but experimental therapies and specialized care required out-of-pocket payments that had consumed their life savings. Isabella's medical team at Phoenix Children's Hospital had documented clear connections between her leukemia and the specific chemical compounds found in their contaminated groundwater. The oncologists were prepared to testify about the causal relationship, but Chen's bias had prevented their medical evidence from receiving proper consideration. Maria's husband, Carlos, worked 3 jobs to cover their living expenses while Isabella received treatment. The stress of medical bills and legal uncertainty had strained their marriage, but they remained committed to seeking justice for their daughter and other affected families. Robert Chen, the rancher who shared the corrupt judge's surname, surveyed the barren land where his cattle operation had once thrived. The contaminated groundwater had killed over 200 head of cattle, destroying a ranching business that had supported his family for 3 decades. The 62-year-old rancher had attempted to rebuild his operation, but the legal costs of fighting Meridian Industries had consumed his savings and forced him to sell most of his remaining land. His sons had been forced to find employment in other industries, ending a family ranching tradition that had lasted over a century. Environmental testing of Robert's property revealed contamination levels that made the land unsuitable for agriculture or ranching for decades to come. The cleanup costs exceeded the property's value, leaving the family with worthless land and no means of recovering their losses through traditional channels. Robert's wife, Patricia, had developed respiratory problems that doctors linked to exposure to contaminated dust and fumes from their poisoned property. Her medical treatments added additional financial strain to a family already struggling with the economic devastation caused by environmental contamination. At Arizona State University's Environmental Science Department, Dr. Vasquez prepared her research materials for the new trial that would follow Chen's removal from the case. Her studies had documented contamination levels that violated federal environmental standards by factors of 10 to 100, creating clear liability for Meridian Industries. The environmental data included soil samples, groundwater testing, air quality measurements, and biological assessments that painted a comprehensive picture of ecological devastation. Vasquez had worked with toxicologists, epidemiologists, and public health experts to document the human health impacts of the contamination. Her research had also identified the specific industrial processes that had caused the contamination, tracing chemical signatures from Meridian's manufacturing facility to affected properties throughout the region. The scientific evidence created an unbroken chain of causation that would be difficult for corporate lawyers to challenge. Graduate students in Vasquez's program had assisted with data collection and analysis, gaining valuable experience in environmental forensics while contributing to a case with significant legal and social implications. Several students planned to base their thesis research on aspects of the contamination study. The university's legal department had initially been concerned about Vasquez's high-profile testimony, fearing potential retaliation from corporate interests. However, The dramatic revelation of judicial corruption had vindicated the university's decision to support their faculty members' expert testimony. Federal prosecutors worked around the clock preparing for Chen's arraignment, organizing evidence that would demonstrate the scope and severity of his criminal conduct. The prosecution team included specialists in public corruption, money laundering, and environmental law, reflecting the complex nature of the charges. Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Torres led the prosecution team, bringing 15 years of experience in public corruption cases to the most high-profile judicial prosecution in Arizona history. Torres had successfully prosecuted state legislators, city council members, and county officials, but had never handled a case involving a federal judge. The challenge of prosecuting a sitting federal judge required careful attention to legal precedents and constitutional issues surrounding judicial independence. Torres worked closely with Department of Justice attorneys in Washington to ensure that the prosecution would withstand any constitutional challenges from Chen's defense team. Evidence presentation would need to be particularly compelling given Chen's status as a federal judge and the potential for public skepticism about corruption charges against a judicial officer. Torres planned to begin with the financial evidence, demonstrating clear patterns of unexplained income that corresponded with favorable rulings. The prosecution strategy would then introduce recorded conversations and witness testimony showing Chen's direct involvement in soliciting and accepting bribes. The evidence would culminate with specific examples of how his corruption had affected actual cases and real families seeking justice through the court system. Inside the Phoenix Metropolitan Detention Center, Chen met with his newly hired defense attorney, former federal prosecutor David Sterling. Sterling commanded high fees and had a reputation for defending high-profile white-collar defendants. But even his experience had not prepared him for the challenges of representing a corrupt federal judge. Sterling's preliminary review of the evidence suggested that the federal case against Chen was overwhelming, with financial records, recorded conversations, and witness testimony that would be difficult to challenge. The defense strategy would likely focus on negotiating a plea agreement that might reduce Chen's potential sentence. The former prosecutor-turned-defense attorney recognized that Chen's best hope lay in cooperating with federal investigators to expose other participants in the corruption scheme. However, Chen's arrogance and denial about his criminal conduct made such cooperation unlikely in the near term. Sterling advised Chen to prepare for the possibility of a lengthy federal prison sentence, explaining that judicial corruption cases typically resulted in severe punishments designed to deter other public officials from similar conduct. The guidelines recommended sentences of 15 to 20 years for corruption of Chen's scope and duration. Chen's family faced their own crisis as news of his arrest dominated local and national media coverage. His wife of 30 years, Margaret Chen, struggled to understand how her husband's distinguished judicial career had been built on criminal conduct that she had never suspected. The couple's 2 adult children, both attorneys practicing in other states, faced professional embarrassment and potential ethical scrutiny related to their father's criminal conduct. Legal ethics rules required them to disclose their relationship to Chen when representing clients in matters that might be affected by his corruption. Margaret Chen faced financial uncertainty as federal authorities froze assets that they claimed were derived from her husband's criminal conduct. Properties in Scottsdale, Aspen, and the Cayman Islands that she had believed were legitimate investments were now subject to forfeiture proceedings. The social isolation was equally devastating, as friends and colleagues distanced themselves from the Chen family to avoid association with the corruption scandal. Margaret found herself defending her husband's character while struggling to understand how she had been deceived for years about the source of their comfortable lifestyle. Media attention intensified as investigative reporters dug deeper into Chen's background, examining his entire judicial career for additional evidence of corruption or bias. Financial journalists analyzed his investment patterns and lifestyle expenses, identifying discrepancies that supported the federal charges. Legal scholars and ethics experts provided commentary about the implications of Chen's arrest for judicial independence and corruption prevention. Some argued that the case demonstrated the effectiveness of federal oversight mechanisms, while others contended that Chen's corruption had gone undetected for too long. The arrest generated international attention as foreign media outlets covered the story as an example of American judicial corruption. The international coverage was particularly embarrassing given Chen's previous participation in judicial exchange programs designed to promote American legal values abroad. Editorial writers across the country used Chen's case to call for enhanced judicial oversight and transparency measures. Reform advocates argued that the corruption might have been detected earlier if federal judges were subject to more stringent financial disclosure requirements and regular auditing. As night fell over Phoenix, the wheels of justice continued turning as federal prosecutors, defense attorneys, and court administrators worked to address the unprecedented situation created by Chen's arrest. The corruption scandal that had begun with environmental contamination had exposed systemic problems that would require comprehensive reforms to prevent future judicial misconduct. The families affected by both environmental poisoning and judicial corruption waited anxiously for news about when their case might be heard by an impartial judge. Their faith in the justice system had been severely tested, but Chen's arrest provided hope that accountability was still possible even for those who held the highest positions of trust. Federal investigators continued gathering evidence as they prepared to present their case to a grand jury, ensuring that all aspects of Chen's criminal conduct would be thoroughly documented and prosecuted. The investigation had revealed corruption that extended beyond a single judge to encompass a broader network of corporate influence and judicial misconduct. The dramatic events of a single day had transformed multiple lives and exposed institutional failures that demanded immediate attention and long-term reform. Chen's arrest marked not just the end of his criminal conduct, but the beginning of a broader reckoning with corruption that had infected one of America's most sacred institutions. The mahogany-paneled federal courtroom buzzed with unprecedented energy as legal professionals, journalists, and curious observers packed every available seat for what promised to be the most significant judicial proceeding in Arizona's history. The irony was palpable as Judge Edward Chen, who had commanded this very type of courtroom for over 2 decades, now sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled to a chain around his waist. Chief Judge Patricia Morrison presided over the arraignment, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that reflected the gravity of the proceedings. Morrison had served alongside Chen for 15 years, never suspecting that her colleague was systematically corrupting the federal judiciary through an elaborate bribery scheme that had enriched him by millions of dollars. The charges read by Assistant United States Attorney Rebecca Torres painted a devastating picture of judicial corruption that spanned nearly a decade. Each count carried potential decades in prison, and the cumulative effect of the 47 separate charges meant that Chen faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Chen's defense attorney, David Sterling, stood beside his client with the resigned demeanor of a lawyer who knew his case was nearly hopeless. The evidence assembled by federal prosecutors was overwhelming, documented through bank records, recorded conversations, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed Chen's criminal conduct firsthand. Sterling's preliminary motions challenged the jurisdiction and timing of the charges, but these legal maneuvers were widely recognized as delay tactics rather than substantive defenses. The former federal prosecutor understood that his best service to Chen would involve negotiating a plea agreement that might reduce the inevitable lengthy prison sentence. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat in the gallery, watching as the judge who had attacked her scientific credentials and professional integrity faced justice for his criminal conduct. The environmental scientist felt a deep sense of vindication as she observed Chen's fallen state, knowing that his corruption had delayed justice for families suffering from industrial contamination. Vasquez's research would finally receive the fair hearing it deserved under a new judge who had not been corrupted by corporate bribes. Her studies documenting widespread environmental contamination would be presented to an impartial tribunal that would evaluate the evidence based on scientific merit rather than financial influence. The scientist's graduate students filled an entire row of the gallery, watching their professor's academic work become the center of a historic legal proceeding. Several students had already begun thesis projects examining the intersection of environmental science and judicial corruption, using the Chen case as a real-world laboratory for studying institutional failure. Pam Bondi observed the proceedings from the front row, her expression reflecting both professional satisfaction and personal vindication. The attorney who had been subjected to Chen's public insults and character attacks just days earlier now watched as the corrupt judge faced accountability for years of criminal conduct. Bondi's legal team had worked through the weekend preparing for the case reassignment that would move their environmental litigation to an untainted courtroom. The months of preparation would not be wasted, but the dramatic exposure of judicial corruption had transformed their civil case into a symbol of systemic reform and institutional accountability. Marcus Rivera sat beside Bondi, taking detailed notes as the arraignment proceeded. The experienced litigator recognized that Chen's prosecution would create important precedents for addressing judicial corruption and ensuring that future cases received fair hearings free from the influence of corporate bribes. Rivera's paralegal, Sandra Martinez, documented every aspect of the proceedings for their case files, knowing that the dramatic circumstances of Chen's arrest would become part of the legal record in their environmental lawsuit. The corruption scandal had elevated their client's case from local litigation to a matter of national significance. Maria Santos clutched her daughter Isabella's hand as they watched the man whose corruption had prolonged their family's suffering face the consequences of his criminal conduct. The mother's eyes filled with tears as she realized that her daughter might finally receive the justice that had been denied by Chen's bias and criminal behavior. Isabella, now 10 years old and in remission from the leukemia caused by environmental contamination, did not fully understand the legal proceedings, but sensed the importance of the moment. Her mother had explained that the bad judge who had tried to hurt their case was now being punished for taking money from the company that had poisoned their water. The family's medical bills continued to mount despite Isabella's improved condition, as ongoing monitoring and preventive care required expensive treatments not covered by insurance. Maria hoped that a fair trial under an honest judge might finally provide the compensation needed to secure her daughter's long-term medical care. Carlos Santos, Maria's husband, had taken time off from his construction job to attend the arraignment. Recognizing the historic nature of the proceedings, the family had sacrificed financially to pursue justice through the legal system, and Chen's arrest vindicated their faith that corruption would eventually be exposed and punished. Robert Chen, the rancher who ironically shared the corrupt judge's surname, watched the proceedings with grim satisfaction as the man whose misconduct had denied justice to his family faced criminal charges. The destruction of his cattle operation and the loss of his family's generational ranch represented just one example of the human cost of judicial corruption. Robert's wife, Patricia, sat beside him with oxygen assistance required by the respiratory problems she had developed from exposure to contaminated air on their poisoned property. Her medical condition served as a constant reminder of Meridian Industries' environmental crimes and Chen's role in protecting the corporation from accountability. The couple's adult sons attended the arraignment, having traveled from their new jobs in other states after being forced to abandon the family ranching tradition. The young men had grown up expecting to inherit a thriving cattle operation, But Meridian's contamination and Chun's corruption had destroyed their family's legacy. Harold Westbrook, Meridian Industries' lead defense attorney, sat in the back of the courtroom with a deeply troubled expression as he contemplated the implications of his former judicial ally's criminal prosecution. The prestigious Denver lawyer faced potential disciplinary action if investigators determined that he had knowledge of Chen's corruption. Westbrook's assistant, Jennifer Kane, continued her research into legal precedents for cases involving judicial corruption, but the Harvard-educated lawyer was discovering that Chen's case was unprecedented in its scope and audacity. The systematic nature of his criminal conduct over nearly a decade had few parallels in American legal history. The young associate faced her own ethical dilemmas as she wondered whether her law firm had been complicit in Chen's corruption through their pattern of significant legal victories in his courtroom. Kane's review of her firm's cases before Chen revealed statistical anomalies that suggested the judge's favorable rulings might not have been based solely on legal merit. Meridian Industries corporate executives watched the arraignment coverage from their Denver headquarters, knowing that Chen's prosecution would expose their company's role in corrupting the federal judiciary. Internal investigations had already revealed that multiple executives had knowledge of the bribery scheme, creating potential criminal liability beyond the environmental contamination case. General Counsel Patricia Wells faced the impossible task of defending a corporation whose legal strategy had been based on bribing a federal judge. The company's board of directors was demanding answers about how their legal department had become entangled in a criminal conspiracy that threatened the company's existence. Emergency shareholder meetings were convening as investors demanded accountability for the management decisions that had led to federal corruption charges. Meridian's stock price had lost over 40% of its value since Chen's arrest, wiping out billions in market capitalization and threatening the jobs of thousands of employees. The company's environmental compliance record was under fresh scrutiny as federal investigators examined whether similar corruption schemes had been employed in other jurisdictions. Internal audits revealed patterns of legal victories and regulatory approvals that seemed statistically improbable without external influence on decision-makers. Thomas Wright watched the arraignment from his modest Tucson home, feeling a complex mixture of vindication and anxiety as his whistleblowing efforts finally bore fruit. The former court clerk had risked everything to expose Chen's corruption, and the dramatic prosecution validated his decision to contact federal authorities, despite the personal costs. Wright's evidence would be crucial in securing Chen's conviction, but testifying against his former boss would require reliving months of anxiety and deception as he secretly gathered evidence while maintaining his normal duties. The psychological toll of his undercover work had strained his marriage and affected his mental health in ways that were still being addressed through counseling. The financial hardship of leaving his court position and remaining unemployed during the secret investigation had forced Wright to exhaust his savings and borrow money from family members. He hoped that federal witness protection programs might provide some financial assistance, but his primary motivation had always been ensuring that justice was served. Wright's detailed logs and recordings would provide prosecutors with insider knowledge of Chen's criminal operations that would be impossible to obtain through other means. His testimony would humanize the corruption by showing how it affected the daily operations of the federal court system and the integrity of judicial decision-making. Special Agent Lisa Chen coordinated with federal prosecutors as they prepared to present their evidence to the grand jury that would formally indict the corrupt judge. The comprehensive investigation had produced thousands of pages of financial records, hours of recorded conversations, and testimony from dozens of witnesses. The agent's meticulous work over 18 months had created an unshakable foundation for the prosecution, tracing money flows through multiple countries and financial institutions to demonstrate the scope of Chen's criminal enterprise. International Cooperation had been essential in obtaining evidence from Swiss banks and Cayman Islands financial institutions. Agent Chen's background in financial crimes had proven invaluable in unraveling the complex money laundering scheme that Chen had used to conceal his bribery income. The investigation had required expertise in cryptocurrency transactions, offshore banking, and shell company structures that sophisticated criminals used to hide illegal proceeds. The federal task force's work had also identified potential corruption in other jurisdictions, leading to ongoing investigations of judicial misconduct that might extend far beyond Arizona. Chen's case was becoming a template for detecting and prosecuting judicial corruption throughout the federal court system. Detective Sarah Mitchell of the Phoenix Police Department reflected on the successful conclusion of her undercover work as she prepared to testify in Chen's prosecution. Her months of surveillance and evidence gathering in the courtroom had provided crucial documentation of the judge's biased conduct and professional misconduct. Mitchell's background in white-collar crime investigation had prepared her for the complex financial analysis required to understand Chen's money laundering operations. Her collaboration with federal agents had created a comprehensive picture of corruption that extended from local courtrooms to international financial networks. The detective's testimony would provide a law enforcement perspective on how Chen's corruption had affected the administration of justice in Arizona's federal courts. Her observations of the judge's biased behavior would help prosecutors demonstrate the connection between his financial crimes and his judicial misconduct. Mitchell's successful undercover operation had required months of careful preparation and execution, maintaining her cover while gathering evidence in a highly visible public setting. Her work exemplified the dedication required to investigate corruption at the highest levels of government and ensure accountability for public officials who betrayed their oath of office. As the arraignment concluded, Chief Judge Morrison announced the appointment of Judge Catherine Williams to preside over the remaining cases from Chen's docket, including the high-profile Meridian Industries litigation. Williams brought an impeccable reputation for fairness and integrity that would restore confidence in the judicial proceedings. Judge Williams had served on the federal bench for 12 years without any ethical controversies or questions about her impartiality. Her background in environmental law and corporate litigation made her particularly well-suited to handle the complex technical and legal issues involved in the contamination case. The new judge's first priority would be reviewing all of Chen's previous rulings in the Meridian case to determine which decisions had been tainted by corruption and required reversal. This comprehensive review would ensure that the environmental litigation proceeded on a clean foundation, free from the influence of judicial misconduct. Williams faced the challenging task of rebuilding public confidence in the federal judiciary, while ensuring that all parties received fair treatment in proceedings that had been compromised by corruption. Her reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail would be essential in managing the complex legal and procedural issues created by Chen's misconduct. The grand jury proceedings that would formally indict Chen began within a week of his arraignment, with federal prosecutors presenting evidence in a systematic manner designed to demonstrate the scope and duration of his criminal conduct. The financial evidence alone required several days of testimony from banking experts and forensic accountants. Rebecca Torres guided the grand jury through the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that Chen had used to conceal his bribery income. The prosecution's presentation included charts and diagrams that illustrated the flow of money from corporate sources to Chen's personal investments and luxury purchases. Recorded conversations between Chen and corporate representatives provided dramatic evidence of his willingness to sell judicial decisions for financial gain. The tapes revealed a man who had completely abandoned his ethical obligations in favor of personal enrichment through systematic corruption of the justice system. Witness testimony from court clerks, attorneys, and court observers documented the pattern of biased rulings that had characterized Chen's handling of cases involving his corporate benefactors. The testimony painted a picture of a judge who had transformed his courtroom into a marketplace where justice was sold to the highest bidder. The grand jury's formal indictment of Chen on 47 federal charges sent shockwaves through the legal community and prompted calls for comprehensive reform of judicial oversight mechanisms. Legal scholars and ethics experts used the case to advocate for enhanced transparency and accountability measures for federal judges. Chen's trial was scheduled for 6 months later, allowing both prosecution and defense teams time to prepare for what promised to be one of the most closely watched judicial corruption cases in American history. The proceedings would be televised and covered by international media as an example of American commitment to judicial accountability. Defense attorney David Sterling faced the virtually impossible task of defending a client whose guilt was documented through overwhelming evidence from multiple sources. Sterling's strategy focused on negotiating a plea agreement that might reduce Chen's sentence in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations of judicial corruption. Chen's refusal to acknowledge his guilt or cooperate with investigators left Sterling with few options beyond challenging technical aspects of the charges and arguing for mitigation during sentencing. The former judge's arrogance and denial about his criminal conduct eliminated the possibility of a cooperation agreement that might have reduced his punishment. The ripple effects of Chen's corruption extended far beyond his individual case, prompting comprehensive reviews of judicial conduct in federal courts throughout the country. Administrative offices implemented enhanced financial disclosure requirements and monitoring systems designed to detect suspicious patterns of behavior. Law schools incorporated Chen's case into their judicial ethics curricula, using his corruption as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining judicial integrity and the devastating consequences of betraying public trust. The case became a standard reference point for discussions about judicial independence and accountability. The environmental litigation that had been corrupted by Chen's misconduct finally proceeded to trial under Judge Williams' impartial supervision. Dr. Vasquez's scientific evidence received the fair hearing it deserved, and the overwhelming proof of contamination and corporate liability led to a landmark settlement that provided compensation for all affected families. Maria Santos and her family received a settlement that covered Isabella's medical expenses and provided financial security for her ongoing care. The compensation could not undo the suffering caused by environmental contamination and judicial corruption, but it ensured that Isabella would receive the best possible medical treatment throughout her recovery. Robert Chen and other affected ranchers received compensation that allowed them to rebuild their operations or transition to other forms of agriculture suitable for their remediated land. The settlement included funding for comprehensive environmental cleanup that would restore the affected areas to productive use. The broader community affected by Meridian's contamination benefited from settlement funds that supported public health monitoring, environmental restoration, and economic development programs designed to revitalize areas damaged by industrial pollution. The compensation represented a measure of justice that had been delayed but not denied by judicial corruption. Chen's sentencing hearing drew national attention as victims of his corruption addressed the court about the impact of his criminal conduct on their lives and their faith in the justice system. The emotional testimony provided a human face to the abstract concepts of judicial integrity and the rule of law. Maria Santos spoke about watching her daughter suffer from cancer while knowing that the judge who was supposed to provide justice was being paid to deny their family compensation. Her testimony captured the profound betrayal felt by citizens who had trusted the judicial system to treat them fairly. Thomas Wright testified about the personal cost of exposing Chen's corruption, describing the anxiety and financial hardship he had endured to ensure that the truth was revealed. His courage in coming forward had made the prosecution possible and prevented Chen from continuing his criminal conduct. Federal Judge Catherine Williams imposed a sentence of 25 years in federal prison, reflecting the severity of Chen's crimes and the need to deter future judicial corruption. The sentence ensured that Chen would spend the remainder of his productive life behind bars, paying the price for his betrayal of public trust. The forfeiture of Chen's assets, including properties in Arizona, Colorado, and the Cayman Islands, provided additional compensation for his victims and demonstrated that crime does not pay, even for those in positions of highest authority. The forfeited assets were valued at over $3 million, representing the proceeds of his criminal conduct. Chen's disbarment and removal from the federal bench were automatic consequences of his criminal conviction, formally ending a judicial career that had been built on corruption and betrayal of constitutional principles. His name was removed from the federal courthouse where he had once wielded corrupted authority. The institutional reforms implemented in response to Chen's corruption included enhanced financial monitoring of federal judges, mandatory ethics training, and improved oversight. Mechanisms designed to detect suspicious patterns of behavior before they could undermine judicial integrity. Legal scholars studying Chen's case identified systemic weaknesses in judicial oversight that had allowed his corruption to continue undetected for nearly a decade. Their recommendations led to legislative proposals for strengthening judicial accountability and transparency in federal courts throughout the country. The environmental cleanup at sites contaminated by Meridian Industries began within months of the settlement, using advanced remediation technologies to restore damaged ecosystems and protect public health. The cleanup represented both environmental justice and a vindication of the scientific evidence that Chen had tried to suppress. Dr. Vasquez's research became the foundation for new environmental protection standards and enforcement mechanisms designed to prevent future contamination incidents. Her work demonstrated the importance of scientific integrity in legal proceedings and the devastating consequences when judicial corruption interferes with evidence-based decision-making. The families affected by both environmental contamination and judicial corruption found some measure of closure in Chen's conviction and imprisonment, though the scars of their suffering would never fully heal. Their perseverance in seeking justice despite systemic corruption had exposed institutional failures and prompted meaningful reform. Pam Bondi's reputation was enhanced by her role in exposing Chen's corruption through her persistent advocacy for her clients despite judicial hostility and bias. Her professional standing as an advocate for justice was vindicated by the dramatic revelation that her opponent had been a criminal rather than an impartial judge. The legal community's confidence in federal judicial proceedings was gradually restored through the implementation of transparency measures and accountability mechanisms designed to prevent future corruption. Chen's case served as a powerful reminder that no public official, regardless of position or tenure, was above the law. Chen's imprisonment in federal penitentiary marked the end of one of the most significant judicial corruption cases in American history, but his legacy would continue to influence discussions about judicial integrity and institutional accountability for generations to come. His fall from respected jurist to convicted felon demonstrated that justice, though sometimes delayed, would ultimately prevail. The restoration of public trust in judicial institutions required ongoing vigilance and commitment to transparency. But Chen's prosecution proved that the American legal system retained the capacity for self-correction when corruption was exposed and prosecuted. His conviction represented not just individual accountability, but systemic vindication of the rule of law. Years later, the Chen case would be remembered as a turning point in judicial oversight and accountability, marking the moment when the federal courts acknowledged that even judges must be subject to meaningful scrutiny and consequences for criminal conduct. His name became synonymous with the importance of judicial integrity and the devastating consequences of its betrayal. The environmental restoration of areas contaminated by Meridian Industries transformed damaged landscapes into productive ecosystems that supported both economic development and ecological health. The cleanup represented a triumph of science over corruption and demonstrated that environmental justice was possible when the legal system functioned properly. Isabella Santos grew up to become an environmental scientist herself, inspired by her family's experience with contamination and her mother's fight for justice. Her career was dedicated to preventing the type of environmental crimes that had threatened her own life and ensuring that future generations would be protected from corporate pollution. The comprehensive reforms implemented in response to Chen's corruption created a stronger and more transparent federal judiciary that better served the American people. His criminal conduct had exposed systemic weaknesses, but the institutional response demonstrated the resilience of democratic institutions when corruption was identified and addressed. Chen's story became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and judicial training programs, reminding future legal professionals about the sacred trust placed in judges and the catastrophic consequences of betraying that trust for personal gain. His corruption served as a permanent warning about the vigilance required to maintain judicial integrity. The victims of his corruption found healing through justice served and institutional reform implemented, though their suffering could never be completely undone. Their courage in pursuing accountability despite systemic obstacles had exposed corruption and prompted meaningful change that protected future litigants from similar abuse. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.